Hello, Avila Advantage students. We are now officially halfway through the course, so great job, everyone. Just keep plugging along. Things to start thinking about in the coming weeks. You're going to have another writing assignment. I believe that's in week 7, so make sure to just kind of review what is still left in the course and stay on top of things. You'll do fine. And this week, we're going to switch to aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis, chapter 24 and 25. You're also going to have a forum discussion, which I think is directly related to you as students because it talks about the enormous size of student loan debt. And you're going to have a little forum discussion, kind of decide what should be done about this. So just make sure to jump in there early, get in there by the initial post by Wednesday, a follow-up post by Friday to appear, and at least one more follow-up post to someone by Sunday. Of course, you can all do these on Monday and Tuesday. People jump in, but just make sure to make a minimum of 2 posts to your peers. Okay, so for this week with chapter 24, aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis. This is a little bit different than we think about a traditional micro like market, say the market for tomatoes, the demand supply. We look at aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We're looking at the supply and demand for all goods and services in a U.S. economy. You think about all the demand for all the goods and services, all the supply of all goods and services. And we look at this from a relative price level. So a higher price relative to a lower overall price in the economy. So when we first discuss aggregate supply curve, it's making some assumptions. It's an upward sloping aggregate supply curve that says as long as the prices of inputs are fixed and as output rises and they're able to get a higher price for those things, they will be willing to supply more to the economy. You think this traditionally from the business side. That's the way I want you to think of it. As those that are the producer of these goods, they'll supply more as the prices go up and their inputs costs stay the same. This will also lead to higher levels of GDP. So if we look at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, what you have on kind of the vertical axis is the price level, and I want you to think about that horizontal axis as being gross domestic product. You know, the total amounts of goods and services produced within the United States borders, regardless if they're foreign owned or U.S. owned. It's that it's being produced here in the United States. So on the other side, we have the aggregate demand curve, which is a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, an inverse relationship, if you will. And this would say that, yes, as the prices are higher, consumers will buy less, and as prices get lower, they will buy more. And there's other theories tied to this, what we call like the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the wealth effect. But if you think simply just, at lower price levels, people can consume more, and that would also drive up gross domestic product. So it's the intersection of these two, again, if you will, that will determine the equilibrium price level in an economy and the equilibrium output or GDP in an economy. And one thing we have to remember, though, is that any given economy, just like a production possibility curve, there's a limit to how much can be produced in a given time period. So that's why in the textbook they talk about this long-run aggregate supply curve that's pretty much vertical. It's inelastic. It says in a given time period, you can only produce so much. So it's like thinking about going to a Chiefs game. There's only so many seats in the stadium. So there are limits to how much we can produce in the economy. So if we continue to push that aggregate demand curve out, you're just going to lead to higher levels of inflation and no real change in output. In chapter 25, it goes into kind of these concepts of shifts. In this aggregate demand curve, we call John Maynard Keynes, who was a famous British economist from like post-1930s. And Keynes had kind of a trouble explaining things mathematically. That's why he wasn't taken as seriously. He kind of understood the situation, but he highly believed that, as long as prices are sticky and you have maybe this relatively flat range of the aggregate supply curve, you can still push out that aggregate demand curve without creating too much of a price increase, but it will help expand the economy, like what we will look at later called fiscal policy. Go ahead and spend the money. Even if you're just giving them a shovel and digging a hole in some national park, as long as they have a job, that will create aggregate demand and can produce higher levels of employment and greater levels of output. So But at some point, we have this intermediate range when that curve starts to go back up that way. And then finally, you have the classical range, which comes like straight up. And that's, as I just mentioned, that if I keep pushing out aggregate demand, that's going to just push up the price level. All right. One of the things they discuss in this chapter is the Phillips curve. And the concept is that there was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So like our economy is improving now, there is concerns that inflation is going to start kicking in. We have low levels of employment. So the Federal Reserve may start to put the brakes on the economy and start raising interest rates. The opposite would be the case like back in 8 years ago after the subprime crisis. We went to 10% unemployment, but there was little inflation because there just wasn't demands for goods. So it was something that we observed throughout history. But in the 1970s, we kind of were in shock because we had both high unemployment and high inflation. That was mostly due to the oil supply shock. So the curve holds true for the most part throughout history, but there are periods of time which it doesn't exactly hold true. All right. Well, that's it for this week. So have a great week, and I will talk to you online. And do send me an email if you have any questions. Take care.